Suppose that secant of theta is equal to 4. We want to find the exact values of the other trig ratios. So whenever it's asking you for the trig ratio, it's asking, like for sine, the opposite side divided by the hypotenuse. It's not asking you to solve for the angle. And then in B here, it's saying find all possible angles of theta between negative 360 degrees and 360 degrees. So in the first part, it's only worried about from 0 to 80, and it wants to find the other trig ratios. In the second part, it's looking for all answers between negative 360 and 360. So to start off with, if we're given secant of theta is equal to 4, probably the first thing you're going to do is change it to one of the primary trig ratios that you know, which are sine, cos, and tan, because you're more familiar with them. Secant is the reciprocal of which one? Cosine. So if secant of theta is 4, that tells you that cos of theta is 1 over 4. Now, according to the cast rule, what quadrant would that be in? If cos of theta is equal to 1/4, what quadrant would that be in? First of all, is 1/4 a positive number or a negative number? Positive number. So if cos is positive, it's either in quadrant 1 or quadrant 4. So what we could do, even though I know that this question says between 0 and 180 degrees, I'm going to, for the purposes of question part B, draw it in quadrant 1. And, well, I'll just draw the angle. Don't want to get ahead of myself here. So there's an angle in quadrant 1 with theta. And here is an angle in quadrant 4 with the same, this would be theta, but this would be your reference angle would be the same there. So if cos of theta is positive, it's telling you it could be in quadrant 1 or quadrant 4. And it really doesn't matter if you draw it to scale or not. I tried a little bit to draw it to scale, but it really doesn't matter. You could just draw any angle in quadrant 1, any angle in quadrant 4. And then if we make a triangle, always back to the x-axis so that your reference angle is labeled, if you know that cos is 1 over 4, that means you can make the adjacent side 1 and the hypotenuse 4. Try your mental math. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. This side will be the square root of? Close, closer. 15. Because the c squared will be the hypotenuse, right, which is the 4. So you're going to have to go 16 minus 1 and get 15 for a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So now we've drawn our triangle. We're able to label all sides of that triangle. And it says determine the values of the other trig ratios. Well, we've got secant and cos. So we're also going to need sine theta, tan theta, and their reciprocals, cosecant theta and cotangent of theta. So sine of theta, well, for part B, it says only consider between 0 and 100. I mean, for part A, only between 0 and 180. So for part A, we're only looking at this triangle, right? Because that's the only one in quadrant 1 or quadrant 2. And sine of theta being the opposite over the hypotenuse will be root 15 over 4. That means that cosecant of theta, the reciprocal, 4 over root 15. Tan of theta, opposite over adjacent, root 15 over 1. And so cotangent of theta will be 1 over root 15. Yes? I knew what quadrant it's in because cos was equal to a positive value. Cos of theta was 1/4. And then according to the cast rule, if I'm thinking of a positive number, I know that they're all positive in quadrant 1. And cos is also the only one positive in quadrant 4. So if cos is positive, it's in 1 and 4. But in part A, it said just look between 0 and 180. That's only quadrant 1 and quadrant 2. So for part A, we're only looking at this one because that's the only one in quadrant 1 or quadrant 2. I drew the other one, even though you don't need it for part A. I drew it because we're going to need it for part B. So we've written the other trig ratios. Now, in part B, it says, let's find theta. So again, this is a grade 10, grade 11 trig question. How do you find theta? You know, we knew that cos of theta was 1/4, right? How would you find theta? You'd use your inverse cosine. So I go to my calculator and say theta is equal to cos inverse of 1/4 second cos 1 divided by 4, 75.5. Does it say to the nearest tenth? Now we're going to start practicing this year already. Does it say to the nearest tenth? Or does it say to the nearest degree? Nearest degree. So be careful here. It's 75.5. Nearest degree would be 76. Now, we are going to practice already this year for next year. Next year when you do your IB course and you write your IB exam, anytime you round an answer, you have to show that this answer isn't exact, it's an approximation. And so instead of writing an equal sign, we will write an approximation sign. Okay? Next year you will get deducted if you don't write an approximation sign when you want to approximate. This year it doesn't matter, but we may as well start practicing it already. And this is the approximation sign that they use. Does anyone know any other approximation signs? Sometimes they have a dot over top. Can be an approximation sign. So, different ways. So we've got 76 degrees. That is our first angle. In fact, when you do cos inverse of 1/4, what we're actually going to do as a practice is we're always going to find our reference angle first. In this case, it is equal to that same angle in quadrant 1. But the reason we find a reference angle is because it could be in quadrant 1 or quadrant 4. So the answer in quadrant 1 is the 76 degrees. If our reference angle is 76 degrees, what's that angle in quadrant 4? $284. 284. So how do we find that 284? Well, we know that going all the way around the circle would be 360 degrees, right? But then if you subtract your reference angle, so looking at the picture, maybe that makes sense. If I go too far, all the way around, that's 360, but then I've gone too far, so I have to subtract my reference angle. And so we've got our second answer. Have we answered everything they want in part B? They want all answers from negative 360 to 360. So one way that I visualize things when I have negative angles and positive angles is I sort of use 0, because you know how 0 starts right here? And I look at my positive answers first. So from negative 360 to 360, that includes 0 to 360, and we got this answer in quadrant 1 and this answer in quadrant 4. But we also have to think about our negative angles, so that would be like going from 0 to 360 in the negative direction. So what would be, going in the negative direction, what would be coterminal with 284? Does negative 76 degrees make sense? It's the same as our reference angle, just in the negative direction. And what will this one be? It'll be negative 284. Now, with cosine, it works out nicely that these will always match up, one positive, one negative, one positive, one negative. That doesn't happen with sine, and it doesn't happen with tangent, but it does happen with cosine. Now, one of the things that I like to visualize when I'm working with negative angles is in quadrant 4, but can you see how going to quadrant 4 in the negative angles is kind of like going to the first negative quadrant? And so I think about positive numbers and just say, oh, this would be like my reference angle, which is 76 degrees. And it's just in the negative direction, so I'd write negative 76. And this one, in quadrant 1, going in the negative direction, it's like going to the fourth negative quadrant. And so I think, well, what's my answer in my positive fourth quadrant? That was 284 degrees, so this one will be negative 284 degrees. And that can sometimes really help. So now we've answered all the angles between negative 360 and 360, and we're done this question. So the diagram helps us see them. We have to find our reference angle to find the one in quadrant 1 and quadrant 4. So for practice, try 9, 10, and 11.